Hey everybody, in this video we're going to be showing you how to paint Barak-Nar the Dark Master for both Warhammer 40,000 and Warhammer Age of Sigmar by Games Workshop. Now this miniature is an absolutely beautiful model and really fun to paint, and easier to paint than it might first seem, so if you're looking to challenge yourself with a big model and you've never painted one before, this is a great one to choose. In this video we're going to be running you through the entire process from start to finish for painting this miniature, and we are going to be finishing ours off for Warhammer 40,000, but it's worth noting that all the things that make it unique to that particular game are optional, and we'll point that out when we get to them. So we hope you enjoy this video, and we'll see you at the desk. To paint Barak-Nar, the first thing that you need to do is to build your miniature as 3 separate sub-assemblies, which I've got laid out just here and undercoated them as well. And the main part to begin with is the main body of Barak-Nar, which I've assembled as one piece. Now these chains on the inside of the wings, there's a good argument for keeping those separate to allow you to access the wing membranes on the insides a bit easier, but they're very fiddly to paint as separate parts, which is why I've chosen to glue them on there. Now to be fair, you could either do it either way you want to, it's entirely up to you there. Now the other parts we've got are the base, and I've also got the dead space marine just here, and you can see I've undercoated Barak-Nar with Chaos Black Spray, the base I've undercoated with Mechanicus Standard Grey, and the Space Marine I've also undercoated Mechanicus Standard Grey. Now this kit actually comes with 2 different dead bodies you can put onto the base. There's a Space Marine that we've got, and there's also a Chaos Warrior, which of course, depending on which way you go, will make the model match one game or the other. You could choose to have neither on the base if you don't want to, but in this case we want the Barak-Nar model to be part of Warhammer 40,000, which is why we're going for that Space Marine. And I'm going to be painting him as an Ultramarine, which is why I've gone for that Mechanicus Standard Grey undercoat. That said, depending on what chapter you want to go for here, you should undercoat it with an appropriate colour. So say, for example, if you want Imperial Fists, you should go for Wraithbone. It's entirely up to you, but what we definitely recommend is that if you've got a friend who collects Space Marines, paint it in their chapter. Anyway, with all that done, what we're going to do is start painting the miniature now, and we're going to start out with Barak-Nar. So we're going to be starting out with painting Barak-Nar, and the first thing to do on him is to make sure that we've got an even and consistent black before we start to pick out any detail on the miniature. Because with a model as complex as this, when you're spraying it with black spray paint, it's very easy to miss parts, and also the spray can behave quite weirdly on some bits and give some different tones. And for the method we're going to be using, it's important that that black is even. So that's what we're going to do now, and to doing this is dead easy. All you got to do is pick out a pitch black for it, and I've got some matte black here from the Army Painter, though if you want to go for Citadel, then a Baden black is the colour to use here. And what you need to do is to pick a brush that can cover a large area quickly, so I'm starting out with a medium shade brush here from Citadel, and I've got some of the black already on my regular palette here. What I'm going to do is thin it down with quite a bit of water to make it quite inky. So I'm bringing it down to around about that point just there. And once you've done so, all you've got to do is paint it all over the flesh. Not worrying about finer details for the time being. Just look for his skin, for example, in the chest here, and just apply a thin coat over the top like this. And one coat will do the job. Just make sure you catch everywhere of the flesh before you move on to the next step. Now when you get to the wings, you might want to switch to an even bigger brush. It's really up to you, but you can see it's quite easy to cover ground quickly because we don't have to worry about any fine detail at this stage. With that even black achieved, we can now move on to the next step, which is to start to apply some greys to the miniature to start to brighten things up and bring out that detail. And the first step for this is to use some Skavenblight Dinge. Now I'm going to be dry brushing this onto the model because with a miniature with this much texture, dry brushing is a perfect technique to use. And I'm actually going to be using some dry brushes from Citadel. Now the reason for this is because the bristles are nice and soft on these, and I'm going to be starting out with a soft dry brushing technique for some smooth highlights. So these are definitely the ones to go for here. And whilst I'm using a medium one to begin with, it's a good idea to have a small one on hand as well. And what you need to do is get some Skavenblight Dinge onto the brush, then get some tissue and use it to work it into the bristles like this until there's not that much left on there. So you can see I'm really working it in and testing it on the texture of the tissue to see what it's going to do, and that's looking pretty good, so I'm ready to start then. Now the tone of this colour actually varies across the miniature, so that's something you need to watch out for. I'm going to start out in areas where we want it to be a little bit darker. So for example on this leg just here, when you're doing these parts, what you do is lightly dry brush like this in a kind of flicking motion, slowly building up the colour, so you start to get that grey picking up on the raised areas whilst it's staying black in the deeper recesses. So you can see this way we're able to control how bright it gets. But when we get to the parts that are going to be lighter, such as the chest, here what you do is increase the pressure and go into a more rounded motion like this, and this way you leave behind considerably more paint and so start to get a lighter colour on these areas. So again for the face, what we want to do is to kind of lift off because it's going to be darker here and just lightly flick back and forth. Then as we get to the horns, we want them to be lighter, so the pressure increases again and we start to work it more into the detail there like that. And so really it's a matter of just doing this across the entire miniature, just adjusting pressure as you go. Generally the limbs are going to be a little bit darker, and so is the face. I'm going to be lighter there, and the tail's darker until we get to the point in it at the end. In which case, again, I'm just going to increase the pressure to start to get a lighter colour appearing on that part there. The same is true on all the horns and the claws and things, so just bear that in mind as you're working your way around the miniature. Now when it comes to the wings, we've got this texture going across them, and when it comes to areas like that, don't go in the same direction as that texture because the bristles will fall into the recesses. Instead, you need to kind of go across it like that. So this way you catch those raised areas. Now, as you're doing the wings, there are, of course, these chains in the way, which is where you might want to switch to a smaller brush. But all you've got to do is just kind of work in between them. So there, for example, then move round, and then there as well. Now, same is true on the back, where again on the membrane you can see there's that texture on it. And so rather than going left and right across it so the brush falls into the recesses, instead go up and down across like that, so you catch the raised areas instead. And for the membranes, just increase the pressure towards the middle of each one so the colour gradually gets lighter in that area. Once you've finished applying that dry brush, you're then ready to make the colour a little bit lighter by moving on to Stormvermin Fur. And this we're also going to be dry brushing on initially, but also we need to do a little bit of layering, which we'll come to in just a moment. But we're going to start out with that dry brushing. And to apply it, I'm actually going to go for the small dry brush from Citadel right from the start this time. But I've got that medium one on hand for larger areas, for example on the membranes on the backs of the wings. But with this, we're looking to dry brush once again, following the same sort of pattern as what we did the previous time. So looking to be heavier on the parts that we want to be lighter, but just a little bit lighter on the parts that we want to be darker. So just adjusting as we need to throughout the miniature. So once you've got that paint prepared, you've just got to start applying it to the model, just like before, as I mentioned, looking for those darker areas and being very light on them. So for example, on the knee just there, I'm just going to very gently start flicking back and forth so the colour just starts catching the raised area along those ridges, especially on the part of the thigh just there. But you can see it's starting to bring out that detail very gently. When we get to parts like the chest where we want it to be lighter, instead it's time to switch to that rounded motion like that, so you start to cover more of the area in a soft dry brush so it gets lighter towards the middle. And you can see this time I'm also focusing it more towards the middle of the chest, so it gets gradually darker the further around towards the back that we go. Now when you get up to the wings, it's the same thing as what we did in the previous stage, again dry brushing across this direction on the membrane so that you catch those ridges, focusing the colour a little bit more towards the middle of each wing, so building up the colour steadily towards the centre there, like that. Now, in addition, we also need to make sure that we catch the horns at this stage and the claws and things like that, such as these ones just here. And we're going to be doing two stages on this. First of all, dry brush it just to make it a little bit lighter, so kind of build up the colour steadily like that. And then what we're going to do is layer over the top of that to smooth it out and finish it off. And to do this, what we need to do is switch to a more medium-sized brush. So in this case, what I'm going to use is a regiment brush from the Army Painter, and I've got my wet palette ready now. I'm just going to get a small amount of this onto the palette and thin it down with that touch of water like we normally do to make sure it's nice and smooth. Bring it down to about that consistency just there. And once you've done so, all you've got to do is apply this onto the horns and the claws. And what we're looking to do is to paint a smooth coat onto the flat area of them. So for example, if we go back to this one, what I'm looking to do is to paint it thinly over this area like that, which you can see will take very nicely because we've got that dry brush already lightening things up. But that makes it much lighter and much smoother. And all you do is bring it down to where it meets the flesh, so around about there, and don't go quite to the corner so there's definition between the two areas. But it's just a matter of doing this on all those claws, so all the ones around the wings and on the feet and on the hands as well, but also the horns as well. And remember on the horns, because we've got these ridges, what we're looking to do is to focus it on these raised areas. And if you've got deeper recesses, for example in there, you don't go quite into the little corner at the top that we've got just there. Instead you go more towards the end of it. So just like there, like that. So we retain the definition that we've been building up from all that dry brushing. There we are, that stage is complete and you can see the model starting to get lighter, but before we move on to adding any more highlights and things to it, what we need to do is do a little bit of shading on those claws and the horns to give a bit more definition to them. And for this, what we're looking to do is to get a slightly darker colour in the middle of the raised flatter areas so that it gets gradually lighter towards those sharper ridges on these details. And so to do this, we need a paint that's a little bit more viscous than a shade, so I'm going to use a contrast paint. Basilicanum Grey is the one to go for here, but it's a little bit too strong straight out the pot, so I'm going to dilute it with some contrast medium, which will ensure it still behaves in the same way, even though the colour won't be quite so strong. So what we need to do is make the mix first of all on the palette, and to do so I'm using my regiment brush once again, and I'm going to go for roughly 50-50. Doesn't have to be exact at all, just something in that area will be absolutely fine. And so I'm starting out with a brush full there of Basilicanum Grey, then we need some of that contrast and just making sure the brush is clean so we don't contaminate it in any pigment, but roughly the same amount, so a full brush full. Put them next to each other on the palette and then start bringing them together. And what we're looking for is a paint of roughly that sort of strength. And once you've got that mixed up, all you've got to do is make sure you've got a good amount loaded on your brush, not loads and loads so it doesn't go out of control, but Well, that is fine. And then all you need to do is start looking for these claws one at a time, and all you do is apply a coat over the top of them. So for example, this one up here, all I'm going to do is paint it all over like that, and you can see it settles on those flatter areas and gives some really nice shading, especially getting darker towards the base of them where they meet the flesh. The contrast paint is now completely dry, giving some really nice shading to those details, and you can see in some cases it's also helping to blend these details together. For example, this spike we got on the tail, you can see it just makes it darker towards the base, which blends it nicely into the flesh beneath it. And with it done, we can now move on to the next step, which is actually to return to Stormvermin Fur, only this time I'm going to do some layering with it. So some smooth painting in thin coats here just to neaten some areas up. Because so far we've used quite a bit of dry brushing to highlight the model, but it can give a slight powdery finish. So essentially what we're going to do is just clean that up a little bit now, using that dry brushing as kind of a reference point to work out where we need to apply it. So Stormvermin Fur, as I mentioned, is the colour to use here, and I'm going to be using my regiment brush to apply this once more. And this time what I'm looking to do is some very thin coats of this colour. So I'm really going to water it down quite a bit. Bring it down to around about this point here, just testing on the palette, see it's nice and translucent. That's the kind of thing of what I want to go for there. So just a touch more. There we go. That's the sort of level we want to bring it down to. And with this, what we're looking for are the lighter areas on the body that have been revealed by the dry brushing. So obviously we've focused a bit more on the chest just here to make it a bit lighter here. This is a great place to start. What I'm looking to do is to paint a thin coat of this colour onto these flatter areas. So there, for example, avoiding the recess and carrying on again on the other side like that. And you can see what this does is lightens that up and also gives a nice smooth finish to it. So ideal for what we want in this area here. You just follow all the way down these muscles along the body there like that. Now in addition, for the darker areas, what we can do with this colour is start highlighting. So for example on the leg, you can see the dry brushing has just picked out certain areas of the musculature there. So what we want to do is look for the parts that stand out the most, such as the knee just here, and just pick it out by painting a stronger line across the area that's lighter. So again down the side just there, on this muscle just along there, and you can see it just helps neaten those areas up. We want to do this on all these parts, so including up on the wings. So we're looking at these sorts of muscles we've got on the inside here. So it would be a case of just kind of working in there and painting along areas such as that. And also these various ridges and things we have on the wings. So areas such as around here as well. Now in addition, at this stage, it's time to return to the horns too, because what we need to do is lighten them up towards the middle. So looking for these raised areas and using the side of your brush, just skim along towards the middle of the horns to make it a little bit lighter along these areas. There we are with that highlight applied. You can see the detail is now standing out nicely, and so we're ready to take it a little bit further by adding a lighter highlight to the miniature. And for this we're going to use Karak stone, and the first stage for applying it is to dry brush it on, but very lightly. And so to do this, what I'm going to use is one of Army Painter's dry brushes, one of their hobby dry brushes here, which has nice stiff bristles, so it's ideally suited towards highlighting like this. And we don't need very much of this, just a small amount on the brush. Then again on your tissue, just work it into the bristles and get rid of the excess until there's hardly any left there. And with this, what we're looking for is to start catching the sharper edges and details and just angling the brush very carefully just to catch those edges. So for example, if we take a look at the leg just here, you can see we've got these ridges running down its length. So what I want to do is angle the brush so I'm going to be going down and catching them in that sort of direction and just very quickly flick across them like that so the colour starts to catch those parts and then move on to that next side. But when they change direction around the other end, you just need to change the angle of your brush to again be going across those ridges like that. And you just gradually build them up in that way. So it's always a matter then of looking for those sharper details. So again, the face, just making sure your brush is angled to be going across those edges and just pick it out like that. Now that direction is important because if, say for example on the face, if I was to go in this direction, the bristles would fall into those recesses. Same on the horns, if I went that way, they'd fall into the recesses, and you need to avoid that. So instead just change the angle so you're going across like that. So this way, you only get the colour on the very sharpest parts of these details. Now in addition, we need to do some dry brushing on the chest, and for this just make sure there's hardly any paint on your brush and just very softly go back and forth just to get a little bit of this colour catching on this area, just to brighten it up ever so slightly on the raised parts of the muscles. So there we go, just very gently there like that. Now in addition, we need to do the wings, and for this, it's a matter of looking for the membrane texture, so you can see those lines running along it. And just kind of go in this direction like this, towards the middle to make it a little bit lighter towards the centre of each of these areas, so very gently like that. But in addition, these tears and these edges we've got, we want to pick out some of those too, so just angle the model so you're comfortable and just bring the brush across those edges as well to get a nice highlight appearing on those areas as well. There we are, the dry brush has been applied and you can see it start to bring out some details, but again, because it's dry brushed, it's a little bit fuzzy, so what we need to do is to finish off with a sharper highlight of Karak stone now, applied in a more traditional way. So for this I'm going to be using my regiment brush again for a medium-sized brush, although you could go for a smaller one if you wanted to. The key thing here is to make sure that you've got a fine tip on your brush, because you are going to need it for some select areas. But for this, just make sure your paint's nicely thinned down in the palette, so just adding that water in as you need to bring it down to about this point here. And then just make sure you don't have loads and loads on your brush, because we don't want it to run out of control. So I'm just going to use some tissue to get rid of excess paint, draw up fresh, and then we're good to go. And with this, what we're looking to do is to kind of trace our steps again of the dry brushing that we did earlier on, and look for any parts that stand out more than others, and just finish them off with a fine highlight. So for example, the knee just here, you can see that highlight's really picking out there. I just want to finish it off with a sharp little line just running along there like that, just to give it a nice highlight to complete it. Now the same is true for any claws and horns and things like that, and again we've got all these ridges around here that we did earlier. What I'm going to do is an edge highlight here, so using the side of the brush, just going to skim along these parts that are standing out the most, just very gently like that, just to get a nice highlight on those bits, just give them a crisp finish to complete them there like that. Now in addition, we want to get these muscles that are on the chest, so we're looking for, again, those areas where the dry brushing picked out more parts and where it's standing out more. So for example, just very carefully along there like that, along there, following the shape of the muscles just to give them that finishing touch and help them stand out. And again on the scar, so just following around that outer edge, such as around there. Now also look for the face and the horns and the claws and everything like that. Any of these edges that are standing out, just take your time working your way around the model, just looking for these parts, just picking them out wherever you need to. So for example, just along there. I've finished applying that highlight across the model now, and you can see it helps all that detail stand out nicely with that sharp finish. And whilst it does take a bit of time to do that step, it's definitely worth taking your time there, because it really helps bring the skin to life. And with that done now, what we're going to do is move on to a very subtle detail that appears on the wings, and that's a slight kind of pinkish hue that appears at the top of the membranes. Now for this, what we need is Carroburg Crimson, which is the perfect colour for it, and we're going to dilute it using some contrast medium. Now the reason for this is Carroburg Crimson is again a little bit too strong straight out the pot, and by using the contrast medium for it, what we're going to do is give it some of the properties of contrast paint. So it's actually going to stick a bit more on flatter areas rather than run into recesses, giving us the subtle effect that we want here. So first of all, what we need to do is make the mix, and once again I'm going to be using my regiment brush. I'm going to start out with Carroburg Crimson just so you can see what I'm doing with it here, starting out with a full brush full there like that. And like with the previous time we were doing a mix here, what we're looking for is roughly 50-50, but it doesn't have to be all that accurate. So as long as it's roughly in that area, then it'll be fine. So about the same amount then of contrast medium, start mixing them together until we get to around about that point just there. And then with that mixed, all we've got to do is start applying it onto the wings in the area where we want that slight pinky hue. And it's at the top of each wing actually, on the inside and on the back as well. What we're looking at doing is applying it into this kind of area just here. And all we've got to do is just paint it into that area there like that, until you're covered about that distance, and then quickly wash your brush, just make sure it's damp, and then draw the paint out a bit further down. So just there like that, so the colour fades out the further down you go. And with that, we now have that subtle crimson hue on the inside of the wings, and so we can move on to the final phases of painting all those horns and claws and things, and a little bit on the flesh too. And for this, what we need is some screaming skull, just for that very final highlight. But then we're going to go to the complete opposite and add some more matte black, and this is going to be just to deepen down some of the very deepest shadows. But first of all, we need that screaming skull, and to apply it, I'm going for a small airbrush from Citadel this time, because here we really don't need very much of this. What we're looking for now is the most prominent parts that stand out the most. We just want a little bit of this colour on the very end of them to make them appear just that bit sharper. So for example, we're going to be looking at things like, say, for example, these claws that we've got on this hand. What we're aiming to do is to apply just a very small amount of this colour on the very end. So just there, for example, and just there. We've also got these spines going back on his forearm, so we want to catch the tips of those as well. So just there and there and there. And you can see I'm approaching this like an edge highlight, so I'm actually using the side of the brush to catch these parts just with little bits, just to get that very small amount. Same on the horns, we're just looking for these little ridges going all the way along, just these little sort of points we've got almost, just follow them all the way along there like that. And also on the face, we can use this to pick out the teeth too. So again, using the side of the brush, just skim along that detail just to catch those edges just there. And also finish off by just picking out the core parts of the expression. So things such as the top of the nose just there, the brow, again applied like an edge highlight using the side of the brush just on areas like that. And also the chin as well, so just down here. With that fine highlight applied, we're then ready to move on to matte black, thinned down just like it was in the original first step. And this is to just get some more definition in some of the recesses where they may have lost some from all that dry brushing. So for example, on the wings, you can see the separation we've got from the fingers and the membranes is a little bit soft. So using this colour, what we can do is paint it into the deepest recess, such as just along there, to get that bit of definition between the two. So you see we're looking at it going all the way along areas like that. Now, in addition, we can do some of this on the body into areas where, again, we've lost a bit of definition. So, for example, these kind of scaly armoured plates we've got. With these parts, we can just paint it into these recesses, such as just there and just along there to get that definition back. Another great place for this is on the face as well, and this is going to be for things such as the ears, so just running it into the recess there like that, and also areas such as the eyes. And with that done, Be'lakor's skin is now complete, as are the wings, the horns, and the claws, and if you think about it, it's actually a huge amount of the miniature done pretty quickly, which is a really great start to get off to with this particular miniature. And now what we're going to do is move on to the next phase, which is going to be to paint in some of the smaller details and trinkets on the body. And what this is going to do is add a lot more colour to the miniature, which is a really good thing to do at this stage, because right now he is quite monochromatic. So by doing this, we're going to add lots more life to the miniature, lots more detail, lots more colour, and it's going to give you a great feeling about how far you've got through painting the miniature by the end of this sequence. Now we're going to be starting out by painting in some burgundy details in the miniature, and there's three. There's the loincloth, his tongue, and also the grip of his sword. And for this, what we need is some Barak-Nar burgundy, which is a really lovely colour, really deep burgundy, perfect for this kind of thing. Now once that base coat's been applied, we then need to shade these details, and for this what we need is some Nuln Oil. But first of all, we need that Barak-Nar burgundy to base coat these details, and for this go for a medium-sized brush. I'm back to my regiment brush for this. All you got to do is get some of this ready on the palette in the usual way, thinning it down with just that touch of water and just adjusting as you need to until it's nice and smooth, kind of like this kind of consistency just here. And once you've done so, all you got to do is start blocking in these areas. And so what we're looking at to begin with is the fabric of the loincloth, so all the way down here. And when you're doing this, you can see it's a bit thin, so apply it as two thin coats. And do be careful whenever you get close to that skin. Just really take your time when you get close to those completed areas and be as neat as you can. So around there, for example. Now, in addition, we need to paint the tongue, and depending on how you decide to build Be'lakor, this might be larger or smaller. You might want to go for a smaller brush for picking it out, but all you got to do is just gently poke the brush in amongst the teeth just to get the tongue there like that. In addition, we need to make sure we base coat the sword grip at this stage. So that's all the way around here. A little bit tricky to get to because of the wings on some angles. So once again, just take your time, making sure you block in the whole area. Once you have the even base coat, the next step is to apply a coat of Nuln Oil all over this burgundy. And once again, I'm using the regiment brush to apply this because you don't want to put on too much at once and run out of control with it, because we need to avoid getting it on the skin. Instead, just apply it evenly over these details, letting it settle into all the recesses. Allow that wash to completely dry, and then we can move on to the next phase of painting this particular detail, which is going to start out with layering it by returning to Barak-Nar burgundy. And I'm going to apply this in a more selective way onto these details now to start to brighten that colour up whilst retaining some of the definition from the wash in the recesses. So as I said, Barak-Nar burgundy once again, and to apply it I'm still going to use that regiment brush, only this time we need to be more selective about where exactly we're painting it on. So thin the paint down a little bit more than the previous time you were using this, so there's a bit more control over it. So just adding a touch more water until it's about this kind of consistency. And then use the tissue as you need to make sure that you don't have that much paint on your brush so it doesn't run out of control and kind of blob everywhere. So you want your brush to be kind of looking sort of like that before you start to apply it. And with this, what we're aiming to do is to paint it onto the raised flatter areas of the fabric and, well, the tongue and the sword grip as well, but avoiding those recesses. So for example, for the fabric just here, what we want to do is follow the direction of it going along the folds. So that means going down it like this, and sort of working our way across these smooth strokes like that, but not going into the deeper recesses such as that crease just there, skipping past it instead and carrying on again on the other side. And by doing this, what we start to do is to build up some really nice smooth highlights starting to appear that we can build on later to make the colour brighter and brighter. It's just a matter of doing this all the way along, like along here. Now in the case of the tongue, there's not that much to pick out here. All you've got to do is just poke a bit of this colour towards the end of it. So we're looking at doing just that bit just there. And when it comes to the sword grip, what we're looking to do is to paint the raised area of it, because you can see it's got this kind of texture on it. To pick that out, just approach using the side of your brush and just quickly skim along like that, just to pick out that raised area. With that colour now neatened up, we can move on to the next phase, which is to really start to brighten it up with the highlights. And to do this, what we need is a kind of greyish highlight to get the almost washed out colour that you can see on the box. But going straight to a grey here will be too much of a jump from the burgundy colour. So what we're going to do is mix two together. What you need is Barak-Nar burgundy and also Administratum grey. And we need to create that mix first of all on the palette. So back to my regiment brush, I'm going to start out with a bit of that burgundy as a fresh amount, so you can see what I'm actually doing here, because what I'm looking to do is to make an ever so slightly lighter version of the colour to begin with. So I'm just going to get a little bit of the grey. So there we go. Put that next on the palette, and I'm going to start mixing them together. Now I'm purposefully just going into the side of my original colour there, because I'm using the mid-tone there of Barak-Nar burgundy to be my guidance point, because what I want is a colour that's just a little bit lighter. And without it, it's going to be a little bit hard to judge. So you can see what I can do is just bring a bit more burgundy in as I need to, and I'm looking to get to about that point there. So I'm happy with that. And then it's a matter of layering it on. So what we need to do is to thin it down as ever, just that touch of water mixed in there. There we go. And then I want to make sure I don't have loads on the brush. So use the tissue to get rid of excess. Get a little bit more water in there, I think. And there we go. So with that done, I know I've got the right shade and I'm ready to start applying it. So what we need to do is to apply this onto these raised areas, kind of like we were doing in the previous step, only more selectively than in that previous step. So for example, if we look at this bit just here, the fabric, you can see this part where it's raised up. What I'm going to do is apply a thin coat onto the top of that raised up area just there. But then I skip past this recess. So it goes from this mix I've got here to Barak-Nar burgundy, to the shaded Barak-Nar, then the Barak-Nar burgundy once again on the other side, before I then pick up with this lighter colour over here. And so what I get is that gradient going from light at the top, getting darker the further in it goes, and it gets gradually lighter again on the other side. So again, there's a slight recess there, so I'm just going to skip past that and apply this colour to this part just here. And you can see what this is doing is building up that volume and giving the appearance of that flowing fabric. Now, once you've got that on there, what you need to do is get ever so slightly more Administratum grey, so just a little bit more mixed in there, and essentially repeat this process by applying this lighter colour even further towards the very top parts of these fabric pieces. So, for example, it's going to be even narrower on there like that, and then skipping past even further past there, and then again just looking for the very tops of these raised areas. That's going to be just along there, painting the direction following the flow of the fabric like that. Bit further along there, and you can see this way I'm building up a really nice highlight on this fabric and getting that smooth transition from dark to light. Now with this lighter mix made up, what we also need to do is to highlight these other parts, and that's going to be the tongue, in which case all we got to do is just paint a finer line towards the end. So it's almost going to be kind of like an arrow shape. So just a little bit along there and a little bit along there, and that's all we need. And then for the sword grip, all you got to do is, like with that previous step when we were layering it, just make sure there's not much paint on your brush, just approach it with the side and just very quickly just skim along just to pick out some of that raised texture. Once you're happy with that gradient, you're then ready to move on to just Administratum grey on its own, this time for a final highlight. And I'm applying it now with a small layer brush for much more control, and all you've got to do is look for the sharpest parts and just very gently skim along them using the side of the brush just to pick them out with a small amount of this colour. Now this will take away that pinkiness ever so slightly, and you can see it also gives that little finishing touch to the fabric, just helping those details stand out. But also look for the rips and tears and pick those out as well. So areas such as just there and just along there. And with that, all those details are now complete, and we can move on to base coating the next area of detail, which is going to be the metallics. And for this, we've got two tones. So first of all, for the silver, what we need is some Iron Hand steel, and then for the gold, what we need is Retributor armour. Now I'm going to be starting out with Iron Hand steel, and there's quite a bit of this to do, so take your time through this phase. Don't rush it, and you'll see why in a moment. But for this, I'm using the regiment brush once again to get this ready, and as ever, just getting it ready on that palette, thinning it down with a touch of water so it's nice and smooth. Now, when we're applying this, what you need to do is work your way around the miniature looking for all these silver parts. So there's things like armour plating, for example, and chains. So the armour plating, for example, that we've got here on the thigh, you just need to block all this in. Just being careful when you get close to the parts we've done so far. So these spikes, for example, just gradually working around there. But not worrying about the gold trim yet, because we're going to be doing that next. So it doesn't matter if you splatter onto there. Also, we want to get things such as the chainmail down here, not worrying about the leather straps for the time being, or the skulls. So just make sure you get this and those hooks. And of course, there's all these chains on the inside of the wings. Now when doing these, just bear in mind it's very easy to get a little bit frustrated with how many there are and start rushing it. And if you do that and you're a bit too vigorous with the brush, what could happen is the paint can splatter and you'll start to get silver flecks appearing on the inside of the membranes. So resist the temptation there. Just take your time gradually filling these in, just paint the parts that you can see, and then just gradually work your brush a little bit around the back just to get the parts that you can see around there. You don't have to paint everything on the back. So just take your time around here, just picking out all these silver parts before you move on to the next step. Once you've got all that silver, you're then ready to start picking out all the gold details using Retributor armour. And here I've switched to my small airbrush for a bit more control, and really these details are once again scattered all across the miniature. For example, the trim on the armour just here is being as neat as possible whilst going around these areas. Also bear in mind though, some of these gold details are very small and can be tricky to spot. For example, there are some rings on his fingers, so be sure to get those as well. I finished base coating those two metallic colours on the miniature, and you can see Barak-Nar undergoes quite a dramatic transformation with that and is looking much brighter. And it's not just Barak-Nar that I did this on, I actually done it on the base at the same time, which you can see just here, just to save a bit of time later on. And with that done, we can now move on to the next step, which is to wash both these metallics at the same time using a black wash. And so to do this, I'm going to return to Nuln Oil, and to apply it to begin with, I'm going to be using the regiment brush again. But it's a good idea to have a larger brush and a smaller brush on hand, so you can change to them as you need to, depending what exactly it is you're washing at that time. But with this, I'd recommend using a palette to help control how much you got on your brush at once so that you don't overwhelm the model with too much of this paint, because what we need to do is focus it just on the gold and the silver. So for example, this armour plate we've got on the thigh just here, I just want to make sure I paint it only over those two colours, just being careful when I get close to those spines, and of course the edge as well where we meet the skin. The wash has completely dried on those metallic details now on Barak-Nar, and also I applied it onto the base at the same time, which you can see is also now dry as well. And with that done, we can now move on to the next step, which is to base coat some other details on the miniature. And here what we need to do is first of all base coat all the skulls using some Zandri dust, then all the leather, and for this we need some Mornfang brown. Once those have both been done, we can then wash these details at the same time with the same colour, and here we need a dark brown. So for this I'm going to use some Agrax Earthshade. But first of all, we need that Zandri dust, and to apply it I'm going to be sticking to my regiment brush, and all we've got to do is get that paint ready in the usual way, with a touch of water to make sure it's nicely thinned down, and then once you've done so, all you've got to do is look for all the skulls, of which there are quite a few. We just need to pick them out one at a time and make sure you block them in with this colour on both Barak-Nar and the base as well. Once you've found all those skulls, you're then ready to move on to the leather details using Mornfang brown. And the most obvious ones here are these straps that we've got on in front of the loincloth, so all the way down here, but there are lots of other ones hidden away too that are usually holding on armour plates. For example, this little one just tucked away just here, so be sure to keep a lookout to get all of these at this stage. Having found all of that leather, you're then ready to move on to washing both these colours at the same time using Agrax Earthshade, and just change brush size as you need to. For example, I'm starting out with a small airbrush here for lots of control, especially when I'm painting these bits of skull down here, and also these bits of leather. The wash is now completely dry on these details, giving lots of depth, and I've also been doing this on the base as well, because remember there's lots of skulls on there too. And here they are, you can see I've applied the wash over those details too. And you can see I've actually been relatively neat with this, just focusing it just on these bits of bone and avoiding the rocks wherever possible. It doesn't matter if you catch those rocks, but we are going to be using Mechanicus standard grey as a starting point for those later on. So minimising that just speeds things up a little bit. But with that done, what we're going to do now is move on to layering the bone. And for this, what we need is some Ushabti bone. And this is to clean it up and brighten it up a little bit as well. And to apply this, I'm going to be using my regiment brush once more, and what I'm looking to do here is to apply a thin coat of this colour onto the flatter areas of those bone details. So just make sure your paint's nicely thinned down and under control, and so it's going to apply nice and smoothly to these areas. And what we're looking to do is to paint it onto these bones, but avoiding those recesses. So for example, if you take a look at the skulls that are down here in the loincloth, what I'm looking to do is to look for these flatter areas, such as around here, avoiding the recess where it meets that gold at the top there, and also any cracks and things in the skull. So just go around there and then follow these details around where the eye holes are. So there we go, on the nose and also on the teeth as well. So you see by doing this, it's brightening them up and also helping the details stand out a little bit more. With those bones layered, you can see now they're looking much cleaner and standing out much better. And so now we can move on to highlighting all these details. And we're going to actually start out by highlighting all the metallic areas. So back to that gold and silver. First of all, for the gold, what we need is some Sycorax bronze to highlight it. And then for the silver, we'll need some Stormhost silver. We're going to be starting out with Sycorax bronze, and to apply this I'm going to be using a small layer brush from Citadel, and here what we're looking to do is an edge highlight on all of those gold details. So we're looking for the sharper edges and we just need to pick those areas out. Now remember, to do this kind of thing, it's really all about getting that paint ready correctly on your palette, just testing it to make sure it's flowing easily from your brush. So this feels pretty good. You can see I'm just testing it on here, seeing how it's flowing. And then I'm twisting the brush to get rid of excess paint so there's not loads and loads on there. Because this way I've got lots of control out of it, it's not going to like blob anywhere. It means I'll be able to accurately apply the highlights where I want them to be. And so I'm going to start out with a highlight on this little plate just here. And what you should do is always angle the model so that you're comfortable, so you can approach with the brush aiming for using the edge of it on these sharper edges. So this kind of fluted up edge we've got along here, for example, see I've turned Bellicor right upside down so I can easily access this part and just skim along with a very natural, comfortable motion to get a nice highlight along that area just there. Then all you got to do is keep turning the model so you can always access that edge, and you just keep working your way around like this, picking out these edges to give them a nice highlight. With that highlight applied to the gold, you can see it standing out nicely, and so now we need to do the same on the silver. So using Stormhost silver, we need to repeat this process first of all on the armour plating, again wherever possible using the side of the brush, just angling the model so you're comfortable and skimming along those sharper edges. Now in addition, if you want to take the gold a little bit further, you can do a very fine highlight on it by looking for the very sharpest points, for example right on that part just there. Just applying a very small amount of silver to that edge, so just these really sharp corners, so just there and just there as well. Now in addition, we need to do the chainmail at this stage, and for this just make sure you don't have much paint on your brush, and with this it's almost like dry brushing it, going down the length of the links, sort of like that, very, very lightly so that it just picks out the texture of it, so very gently. You don't have to get all of it, just the parts that stand out the most, so just there for example. And then finally, there are all these chains that are on the wings, and for these, you don't need to highlight everything, instead just angle your brush so you just catch the raised area of them and just skim along them like that to get a nice highlight on the raised parts of the links. And with that, the metallic details are now complete, and we can move on to finishing off that leather and also all the bone. And for this, we need two colours. First of all, some Skrag brown for the leather, and then for the bone, what we need is some Screaming Skull. So first we need Skrag brown, and to apply it I'm going to keep with that small layer brush, and with this all you got to do is again look for the edges on these details and just gently pick them out. And there's not that much leather, so it's quite a quick step to do this one, but it's like with the edge highlighting of the metal, what you need to do is just keep moving the model around so that you're comfortable as you're applying these highlights, because some can be a little bit tricky to get to. So you just need to turn the model so it's comfortable to get to them. So for example, on the forearm just here, you can see we've got this strap here. You can see I'm turning the model around quite a bit, just so I can approach using the side of the brush and just skim along that edge there like that to get a nice highlight on that leather. And it's really just a case of doing that on all the various leather details in the miniature. Now these straps we've got towards the middle on the loincloth, these are a little bit thinner, so you don't have to do both sides. Instead focus on the one that's kind of towards the top of the model that would catch the light. So in this case, it's going to be along this side right here. And finally, we're ready to highlight the skulls using Screaming Skull. And with this, all we need to do is approach with using the side of the brush and just go around the eye holes, so around there and around there, just catching the cheekbones, across the top of the nose, and then across the teeth. I've finished highlighting all those skulls, which means that all the bones are complete, as are all those details, all those little trinkets and bits and pieces like that. So with that done, we can now move on to the next major area, which is going to be the Blade of Shadows, which we're going to do for that sort of bluish effect with the purple smoke coming off it. But also at the same time, we're going to be painting in the scar on his chest with the blue effect and the eyes. Now on that scar, you might want to do it more like on the box cover, where it's more of kind of like a reddish kind of colour. And if you want to do so, then just paint it in the same colours as what we used on the loincloth. We, however, are going to be going for that bluish glow that appears on the Warhammer 40,000 variant on the back of the box. And the first step for doing this is to base coat with Stegadon Scale Green, and then we're going to start picking out some select details using Sotek Green. But first of all, we need Stegadon Scale Green, and to apply it I'm going to begin with my regiment brush, but I've got a smaller one on standby which we'll need shortly. And for this first one, all we're looking to do is to thin it down in the usual way with that little bit of water, and using this, it's a matter of blocking in the entire blade on the sword. So to begin with, don't worry about the smoke or anything like that, just make sure you get all the blade along here, all the way across it there like that, and just be careful when you get close to that gold, in particular when doing this little part in here. And here you might want to switch to a smaller brush, depends on how you feel about that area. Where you definitely need a small brush, however, is when we move on to doing the scar and the eyes. And so for this, I'm going to switch to my small layer brush, and with this we just need a small amount, just thin down a little bit more now, so kind of to that point there. And using this, what we need to do on the scar is wash it into the recessed area. So you can see it's just a case of angling your brush so you're comfortable, and then just running it into the recessed part. So all the way into there, going all the way around there. So following that chaos design all the way around. As for the eyes, what we're looking to do is to again wash this into the recessed part. So it means looking for the socket and just running it into this entire area just here. With that base coat done, you're then ready to move on to Sotek Green, and there's a few things to do here for which I'd recommend using a smaller brush, so I'm using my small airbrush now. First of all, on the blade, look for all these parts that are etched out of it that are moving up into smoke, and just apply this colour directly into each one of these recesses, so all the way along these areas going here, such as here and just here. In addition, set us up for later on, apply a quick edge highlight to the blade as well, so using the side of your brush, just skim around the outer edge, so just running around that sort of area just there. Now also, we need to do a little bit on that scar and the eyes as well, so going to the scar first of all, like in the previous step, just apply this into the recess of the area. So just around here, for example, have that initial base coat that we put on previously means this is going to apply nice and easily into these areas, it's just a matter of us running them into the entire recess there, like that, so the colour becomes brighter. As for the eyes though, in this case we don't want to wash it into the recesses now. This is a case of picking out the raised area, so just brace yourself as steadily as possible. Just gently move in and just pick out the centre of the eye, so just there. With that done, we've got the base coats applied to these blue areas and started to set ourselves up for the highlights, which we're going to continue later on. But before we do that, what we need to do now is to block in the smoke that's coming off the sword. And for this, we need a greyish purple. So Daemonette Hide is a great colour to use here. Now to apply this, I've gone back to my regiment brush. And for this step, all we're looking to do is to block in all of that smoke. So you don't have to worry about being overly neat with this, for at least for the majority of it. So as ever, just make sure the paint's thinned down, that you've got a good amount on your brush. There we go. And then it's just a matter of applying it onto these areas. So I'm going to start a bit on the more opened up areas up at the top here, where we're just going to be blocking in all this smoke. But as you get down to the blade, you can see it kind of starts going on top of the blade. It's kind of trails going onto it. And what we want to do is generally follow those, picking them out. Now they'll already be kind of bluish because of what we did in the previous stages, but all you do is just bring it down to points like that over the blade. So you can see I'm just going on top of it. It's not really blending or anything. It's more just these trails going out to a point. So all you got to do is just take your time working your way down the blade doing this. The smoke is now blocked in, so we can move on to the next step, which is to apply some shade onto these details to give the effect of a bit of a glowing blue going on the scar and the eyes, and also to start to darken down the blade a little bit as well. And for this, what we need is some Coelia Greenshade, followed by some Nuln Oil. So first of all, Coelia Greenshade, and to apply it I'm going to be using my regiment brush once again, and with this it's a good idea to get it onto the palette because we need quite a bit of control over this, and in fact what we're going to be doing is using a bit of water to help blend it in surrounding areas, which you'll see how in just a moment. And the trick for doing this is to make sure we're not applying loads at once. I'm going to start on the scar, but on the eyes we need to do the exact same thing. What we're looking to do is to apply it onto the shape of it. So for example, starting on these arrows around here, what I'm going to do is apply it like this, but purposely just bringing it over the edge of the design. So some of that colour staining the chest like that. Then once you've done one, just very quickly wash your brush, make sure it's just damp with some water, and then just go around it. So this way what you do is you fade out that colour into the surrounding area. So you start to get kind of like a bluish glow on there. Now depending on how strong you want this to be, you can apply multiple coats, but just remember to do each one as a thin coat so you can control how strong the effect is going to be. On the eyes, do the exact same thing. Now on the sword blade, we're looking to do something similar, although we need to cover more ground quicker on this. So I'm going to start out with a bit more of this paint on the brush. What we're looking to do is to paint it onto the flat of the blade. So I'm going to start on here, and we're just looking to paint it on thinly like this, just working it all the way across so it settles in that detail and just helps bring those colours together. So I'm just bringing it a little bit onto the smoke, just covering that area like that. And then once you've done around about that much, like before, just make sure the brush is washed, make sure it's damp with some water, and using this, what we need to do is just bring that colour a little bit up onto the smoke. Once you're happy with that, you're then ready to move on to Nuln Oil, and this is for this purple smoke. And with this, what we need to do is to apply it over the smoke around here, and then like before, when we get close to that transition, just wash your brush, make sure it's damp with some water, and then just pull the paint down to get a transition between the two. Allow those washes to completely dry, and then we're ready for the next step, which is to do a little bit of layering on the smoke to bring some of that purple back to it. And for this, we're going to return to Daemonette Hide, and this time we're going to be applying it more selectively. So I'm going to be starting out with a small airbrush right from the start here, and what we're looking to do is to apply this colour onto the areas that kind of are standing out more, so the curved areas that are kind of coming out more from the effect. So for example, the kind of thing I mean are things like these curves that we've got just around here. And what we're looking for is the part that stands out around this curvature. Let's apply it onto that area there as a thin coat, leaving it darker when it goes into the little corner just there, then carry on again on the other side as it opens up once more. With the layering done, we're now set to move on to highlighting these details, and we're going to be starting out with the blue, for which we need two colours. First of all, we need some Ahriman blue, and then after that we're going to move on to Baharoth blue. But first we need Ahriman blue, and to apply it I'm going to be sticking to that small layer brush throughout, and with this what we're effectively looking to do is to edge highlight a whole number of details. So we don't need loads of this paint, but we do need to make sure it's thinned down correctly to the right point so that we've got lots of control over it. So just test it as you need to on the palette, adding more paint or water as appropriate until you get to the point where it's flowing really easily from your brush. And you can see I'm just testing it here, and that's looking pretty good right there, so I'm going to go with that. So next thing to do, make sure there isn't loads on the brush, and once that's done, it's a matter of looking for these edges. And I'm actually going to be starting on the scar on the chest. And with this, what you can do for most of it is to use the side of your brush, and all you've got to do is just angle it so that you're approaching about that 45 degrees from the flat, and then just very carefully bracing your hands so you're nice and steady, just gradually start building up that colour on the edge. So you can see I'm using the side of the brush, just going back and forth, just building that colour up so I get that brighter blue starting to appear on the edge of the scar. So very gently there like that, and turning the model so that you're nice and comfortable and just gradually working your way around. Now, in addition with this colour at this stage, we need to pick out the eyes, and for this, again, just a small amount, brace your hands so you're nice and steady and just gradually move in and just apply a little bit of this colour to the eye so you get that brighter blue starting to appear right there. And then there is, of course, the sword to do as well. Now for the sword, once again, we're looking to edge highlight it, so I'm going to start using the side of the brush and work my way around, so along there, for example, to get that brighter blue. I'm going to start bringing it a little bit up into the smoke as well, so just a little bit up there. And also, as I'm doing that top edge, I'm looking for those recesses that we did with that brighter blue earlier on. We need to make them much brighter now, so with this colour, just paint it into the very deepest part of that recess. So for example, in there, just run that colour into that part and along there as well, and just gradually work your way across the blade doing this. Now finally, there is that central line on the blade that we need to pick out as well, and for this, again, just remember to angle the model so it's nice and comfortable in your hand, because what we're looking to do is to paint a straight line. And in this case, just look down the length of your brush and just work your way down, because this is a nice comfortable way to get that straight line running all the way down that blade. With that done, we're then ready to move on to Baharoth blue, and with this we're looking to largely retrace our steps, only with finer lines. So starting on that chest, it's once again an edge highlight, just being much more delicate with the colour because it's brighter now, and we want this just to finish off that glow effect. So very gently across there. Same for the eyes, and also on the sword blade as well, not forgetting to do those recessed parts deeper in the blade. And with that, the blue is done, and so now we can move on to finishing off that smoke, and for this, once again, we need two colours. First of all, we need some Slaanesh grey, and then we need a very small amount of Administratum grey to finish it off. But we're going to be starting with Slaanesh grey, and to apply it, once again, I'm using that small layer brush, and what we're looking to do here is to look for any sharper bits on the texture of the smoke and pick those parts out. And this will bring us right down onto the blade, so it's kind of edge highlighting, though it's a little bit more of an organic process than that. But as ever, just make sure the paint's ready on your palette, and then it's a matter of looking for these edges. And for example, the kind of thing I'm talking about is on this bit of smoke that we've got just at the very front here, I'm looking for kind of this sharper edge we've got running along the side, and I'm just going to skim along that, following it along, and you'll see it kind of disappears part way down. So as it disappears, I'll just lift the brush away not to catch that part. But then it reappears down here, so I'm just going to carry on, and I'm going to bring it down to the highlight on the blade, just slightly going over it to merge the two together. So it's a matter of just repeating this all the way down the blade. And then finally, all we need is a small amount of Administratum grey as a final highlight to the end of the smoke effect. So all you got to do is apply just little bits towards the end of each trail, such as around there. And with that, the sword is complete, and so in fact is Be'lakor, and we can move on to painting his base now. And for this, what we're going to do is paint all that stone. Now remember, the base was originally undercoated with Mechanicus Standard Grey, and since then we painted in the metal and the bones on there. So at this stage, if you need to neaten up any of that grey on the stones, do so now with Mechanicus Standard Grey, because what we're going to do now is apply some wash to it to deepen down the colour, define the recesses, and give it a slightly mossy natural feel. So for this, what we need is both Agrax Earthshade and Athonian Camo Shade, and I'm going to apply them both at the same time. The brush I'm going to use is a medium shade brush from Citadel, which can hold plenty of paint and also will allow us some control here because we need to be careful of those bones. And with this, what we need to do is load up plenty on your brush and then just pick a starting point on the stones. So for example, around here, all you do is just start painting this on, making sure it settles into all that recess detail and just being careful as you get to the bones and the metal, just gradually working your way around them like that. Now, as you're applying this, every now and then just pick up up some Athonian Camo Shade instead and just apply it randomly, let the two colours mix as you go, and this will give that natural, slightly mossy feel to the stone. Give those washes plenty of time to dry, and once they are dry we can move on to the next step, which is to dry brush all that stone to bring out some of the texture. And for this what we need is a medium grey, so I'm going to use some Dawnstone for this. And to apply it I've got a medium dry brush from Citadel, but it's a good idea to have a smaller one on hand because you'll need it around some of the bone details. But what we need to do is dry brush this lightly onto the stone, so use some tissue to work the paint into the bristles and get rid of the excess. And then all we need to do is start flicking it back and forth across that texture. So we're looking at the areas like these steps down here. Let's go back and forth so the colour starts to catch those raised areas and some of the flatter areas too, because we're using one of those Citadel brushes with slightly softer bristles, so you can see it catches some of the flat areas too. So it gives a really nice effect on that stone. Just take your time when you get close to the bones, and if you need to, switch for a smaller brush, but all you got to do, just evenly apply this across all of the stone. I finished applying that dry brush, and the next thing to do is to darken down some of the rocks for those kind of spires that are sticking up for a cool effect as they appear to get darker the further up they go. And for this what we need is some Nuln Oil, which we're going to be applying in multiple coats. Now I'm going to be using a monster brush to apply this from the Army Painter, and all you got to do is get some ready on the palette to help control how much is going on at once. So there we go, got a little puddle of it. And then what we're looking to do for each of these spires is to start out with a coat that's going to go down kind of close towards where the steps are. So we're looking at around that point there, and all you do is apply it going all the way up to the top. Once that Nuln Oil is dry, apply a second coat to the stone a little bit further up towards the tips of each one to make it darker the further up we go. And really here you can apply as many coats as you like, so keep on going until you're happy with how dark the stone is. I've finished applying that Nuln Oil now, and you can see the result as it gives the impression that the stone is almost burnt at the top of those spires, so perfect for a demon like this. And with that done, we're now ready to move on to finishing off the stone with two highlights for which we're going to be dry brushing them on. First of all, we need a light grey, so I'm going to use some Administratum grey here, and then we need a bone colour just to finish it off for a slight dusty effect, and for this I'm going to use some Screaming Skull. But first we need that Administratum grey, and to apply it I'm back to that medium dry brush from Citadel, and this is going to be very similar to that dry brush we did earlier on, only a little bit lighter. So slightly less paint to work into the bristles this time. There we go, and once you've got that prepared it's just a matter of lightly applying this to the stone. So again, being careful of all those skulls and chains and things as you apply it. We also want to be very light and gentle with this, so we start to get that light grey catching those edges, a little bit on the flatter areas but mostly on the edges, and then very, very lightly as well on these spires, just to give the hint of a lighter grey on the sharpest edges. Once you're happy with the colour, you're then ready to move on to Screaming Skull for a final very light dry brush. And to apply this, I'm using an Army Painter Hobby dry brush because the stiffer bristles will mean the paint tends to catch the edges more, giving a nicer highlight than the Citadel one would do. And so you can see what I'm looking for here is just a light colour on the very edges of these details of stone. And with that, the stone is complete. And of course, we painted this in quite a dark grey because we wanted it to look a little bit like on the box, but a different tone of grey from Be'lakor so that he stands out from it. But really, you can paint the stone in any colour you want here. And in fact, you might want to vary it depending on your basing scheme. So for example, if you're doing a desert base, you might want to do it more of a kind of sandstony colour. It's really up to you. But once you have done that, the next thing to do is to paint the lava in amongst it. And for this, we're going to start out with a base coat of Khorne Red, then brighten it up using some Wild Rider Red. And this is going to be the first stage before we move on to making it a really kind of fiery orange colour. But first of all, we need that Khorne Red, and to apply it I'm using my small layer brush, and with this all we're looking to do is to block in this area, but because it's kind of embedded amongst the rocks, what we need to do is to thin this down and almost wash the paint in. So add some water to it so it's a bit more runny than normal, so kind of that sort of consistency there. And once you've done so, all you got to do is start identifying all the trails of lava and just paint this into those areas. So for example, around here you can see there's some, and all I'm going to do is just sort of wash this paint into the recess to cover the whole thing, following it all the way down. Now the lava tends to appear from around there and goes all the way down to the ground, but bear in mind there is some around the back as well, so don't forget about that. For example, there's some around here kind of dripping out the eyes of this skull-like structure we've got just here, so be sure to get all these parts too. Once you've found all that lava, the next thing to do is to move on to Wild Rider Red, and with this colour what we're looking to do is to paint some lines in the middle of each of these sections, so just generally following along in this sort of area. Once you finish with Wild Rider Red, you can see the colour of the lava is standing out much more now, and so what we need to do is take it a bit further and bring it closer up towards the white, going through some yellow. And so for this, what we need to do first of all is go to an orange. So here I'm going to use some Trollslayer orange. Then we need that yellow, and this is going to be some Uriel yellow. Finally, we just need a small amount of white, and here I'm going to use some matte white from the Army Painter. But first of all, we need that Trollslayer orange, and to apply it, once again, I'm going to use that small layer brush. And with this now, rather than painting it everywhere, what we need to do is to focus this colour on where we've got larger quantities of the lava showing through. So larger blobs and things like that. So for example, what we're looking at is areas such as this little kind of corner that we've got right here. And with this, all you're going to do is just start applying it into that area with 2 coats just to make the colour stronger and brighter in these larger quantities. Next up, we need Uriel yellow, and with this colour, what we need to do is again focus it towards the parts where there's larger quantities of lava and just paint it into the middle of these areas. So for example, around here, just in that kind of area there. And finally, we just need a very small amount of matte white just in the middle of these largest areas just to give that final impression of hotness. And with that, the lava is complete, and we can move on to the next thing, which is actually something that's a bit personal and entirely up to you how you paint it, because there are some Space Marine bits and pieces discarded on that base there from dead Marines, and now is the time to paint those, including the separate assembly of that separate dead Space Marine. Now the colour scheme here is entirely up to you, but what we recommend you do is that if you've got a friend who collects Space Marines, you paint them in that colour scheme. But on the Academy, we've got lots of different guides of painting different Space Marine chapters, so whichever one you want to do, pick that video and paint the Space Marine in that way. That's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to paint these parts as Ultramarines, and then when we come back, we can carry on painting the miniature. And it's worth bearing in mind as well, if you decide to go for the Age of Sigmar variant with the Chaos Warrior, we also have a video on that, so just follow that guide to paint that detail. But as I mentioned, what I'm going to do now is paint those parts and then stick on the Space Marine onto the base. When we come back, we'll paint the soul that's coming out of it. And here we have the base with those Space Marine details painted and the dead Space Marine glued on as well, who are stuck on with a little bit of super glue. And the reason why we're doing this way round is because now as we move on to painting the soul, having the base to handle is much easier than handling the Space Marine separately whilst doing this kind of thing. So just more convenient this way. And what we need to do to paint this soul is to start out with a base coat of Ahriman blue, followed by a base coat of Daemonette hide. So similar colours to what we use in the sword to keep a similar palette here. I'm going to start out with Ahriman blue, which I'm going to be applying using my regiment brush, because for this first step, all we've got to do is block in the whole effect. So we don't want to be too neat for most of it. So what we've got to do is get the paint ready in the usual way and then just start base coating this detail. So what we're looking at is this kind of swirly thing we've got coming out of the Marine, so all the way along here, and it kind of goes to points as it gets down to meeting his body. So all you need to do is to follow that trail to that point, so just down there. Once you have that even blue, you're then ready to move on to Daemonette hide. And with this colour, what we're looking to do is to thin it down with a bit of water and apply it towards the end, around about halfway down of each of these strands. Now when you get to about this point, quickly wash your brush and just make sure it's damp with a little bit of water and just kind of smudge the end of it to blend the two colours into each other. The two colours are now blocked in, so we can move on to the next step, which is to wash them. And for this, we're going to use 2 washes at the same time. For this, what we need is some Coelia Greenshade and also some Nuln Oil. And what we're going to do is apply Coelia Greenshade first onto the bluish parts, then add the Nuln Oil onto the purple parts. So to do this, I'm going to go for my small layer brush for lots of control. I'm going to start out with some of the green shade, so just a little bit of that there on the palette. And with this, what we need to do is to pick one strand at a time to make sure that we can still work on this whilst the paint remains wet. So for example, I'm going to start on this one right in the middle just here. All you've got to do is apply the green shade over the blue parts like that, just being careful when you get close to the gold of that chest design right there. And then just bring it a little bit over the purple. Now, whilst it's still wet, just grab a little bit of Nuln Oil. Don't worry too much about washing your brush for this because the colour's so dark. All you've got to do then is apply it onto the purple parts so that the two colours mix in the middle just there. Once those washes are completely dry, all we need to do is to highlight this detail to finish the miniature off. And for this, what we need is some Baharoth Blue, followed by Slaanesh Grey. I'm going to be starting with Baharoth Blue, applied again using that small layer brush. And with this, it's going to be kind of like when we're painting all that smoke on the sword earlier on. We're looking for kind of the sharper texture on this detail. We just need to follow that along, but focused on the blue side of the smoke. So what we're going to do is get that thin down and ready as ever, just making sure the brush isn't overloaded. And then it's just a matter of identifying those areas. And so, for example, what we're looking for on this one just here is things like this little trail I've got going to the chest. So right there, just very carefully picked out with the side of the brush, just following it along up to this point here where it transitions over to that purple. I want to bring it up to about that point there. Finally, we're ready to move on to Slaanesh Grey, and with this, all you've got to do is continue that highlight, so you can see the strand we've got coming along here. Just carry it on all the way up to the end of the smoke to complete the effect. And once you've done this, you're then ready to base the rest of the base. And well, you can see there's some open space on here and also some texture on there. For this, I'm just going to sand around here and bring the sand onto that texture as well to help blend it all together. And then, of course, you just need to paint it in whatever scheme you want to go for to match the rest of your army. In this case, I'm going to go for grasslands, and once that's done, it's then time to glue Be'lakor on top of the base. And for this, make sure you use super glue, not plastic glue, so as to avoid damaging any of the paintwork. And here we have the completed Be'lakor, the Dark Master, ready to lead his forces against his enemies. So when painting Be'lakor, the key thing first of all is dry brushing the skin to really bring out all that texture. But remember, it's a good idea to do a very thin layer over the skin, especially on the chest part way through, just to even out that dry brush to take away the slightly powdery finish it can give. Also remember to do that fine lining with the black later on as well, just to redefine some of the shadows. But once you painted all the flesh, the skin and the horns, really the rest of Be'lakor is very simple. Just remember not to rush it, especially with the chains, because it's easy to get carried away and splatter that silver on the inside of the wings. So just take your time to avoid that happening. Anyway, have fun painting your Be'lakor, and especially have fun to painting the Space Marine in your friend's colour scheme. We'll see you all again very soon.